Hi there, my name is Aifric and I'm a lecturer in the UCD Institute of Food and Health. And I'm talking to you this evening about what is a sustainable, healthy diet. So I'm really just going to kind of talk through the definition of a sustainable, healthy diet and then look at some of the challenges that we face in kind of setting guidelines around sustainability. And then lastly, I'll finish off talking through what we can do to eat a more sustainable and healthy diet. So just to start off with some of the challenges we're facing that are forcing us to look at how we produce and consume foods. So we're living in a world where our global population is growing. So we expect to reach 9 billion by 2050. At the same time, human behavior is changing. So although undernutrition exists, it coexists along with overweight and obesity. And with overweight and obesity, there's overconsumption and therefore an increased demand for food. And that increased demand for food puts extra pressures on our food system, which is already unsustainable as it is. So our food system generates about 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions, about 33% of our waste. It uses about 40% of our land and about 70% of fresh water. So that food system is already under pressure and is coming under further pressure with the environmental changes. So things like climate change, water and land shortages make food production even more difficult. So as I said, we need to produce and consume foods more sustainably. So with that in mind, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization defines a sustainable diet as those diets with low environmental impacts that contribute to food and nutrition security and to a healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. So that's quite a mouthful. So I've highlighted 4 key themes within that sustainable diet's definition. And so to simplify that, we can describe a sustainable diet as a diet that has a low environmental impact, meets nutrient requirements, is culturally acceptable, and is affordable. And so before I talk you through a couple of the challenges that we face in achieving that sustainable diet definition, I first want to just mention how we measure food sustainability. So there's lots of different ways to measure food sustainability. The common ones are looking at land use, looking at water use, or greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to focus on greenhouse gas emissions because some of the research that I'm going to refer to uses greenhouse gas emissions as a measure of food sustainability. So we can estimate the greenhouse gas emissions associated with food production. And we usually count up everything that goes into producing, processing, transporting, refrigerating, even up as far as the consumer waste at household level. So when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions for a particular food, it typically accounts for the greenhouse gas emissions across that whole chain. And so I'll draw your attention over to the right-hand side of this slide, and I've borrowed this from the British Dietetic Association because it presents a nice visual of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with different types of foods. And the way they've presented this, so we're looking at this first column here with the clouds. And so it's the greenhouse gas emissions reported as kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per 100 grams of protein. And as you can see, at the higher end of that scale, we have foods like lamb and beef. Somewhere in the middle, we have things like eggs and poultry. And then at the lower end, we have the plant source proteins, so things like nuts, beans, and peas. So this kind of just shows us that different food groups that we eat have different impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. So it raises the question of, can we impact environment by reducing our consumption of some of these higher greenhouse gas emission foods? So that brings me to my first key challenge that I want to talk about, and that's consumer acceptance. So to align with the definition of a sustainable diet, it must be acceptable to consumers. So food production is driven by consumer demand. So then we would expect, if we can change consumer demand for food, so if we can change people from wanting more kind of meat-based protein to looking for more plant-based protein, then production should follow that change in demand. But if we're asking people to reduce the amount of meat protein they consume, then we are actually asking them to incorporate new foods into their everyday diet. And I suppose I'm posing the question, is this acceptable to the consumer, and what do consumers think? So imagine that you're trying to change your diet, you're trying to be more or eat more sustainably. Well, one of the sustainable protein sources that both researchers and scientists are looking at now is insect-based protein. So can you imagine sitting down to a plate of insects to meet your protein requirements? Probably not, but you might be willing to try a food product that's made out of that insect protein. And there are several new types of food products that are kind of coming onto the market, I suppose. Or other types of sustainable protein sources are things like lab cultured meat. So can you imagine eating your next burger and it being made from lab cultured meat? So it's not just important asking the question, would you be willing to try this? But can you see these types of sustainable protein source foods becoming part of your everyday diet? And that's the question that this first research study looked at. So in this study, they recruited almost 2,000 older adults across 5 European countries. And they asked that question, how ready are you to accept alternative protein sources? And the 7 protein sources, that some of them being alternative, were plant-based protein, then meat, dairy, and seafood protein, which are what we would consume kind of more readily most days. Then the very novel ones are ones that I've mentioned. So the insect-based protein, the in vitro meat-based protein, which is that lab or cultured meat that I mentioned. And then finally, the single-cell protein, which is protein that's derived from microorganisms like algae and yeast. So corn, for example, is a single-cell protein. So they asked this question, how ready are you to accept these as part of your everyday diet? And this is the results. So as you would expect, those foods, the meat source protein, dairy, and seafood, are all part of most people's diets, and the results show that. So kind of almost up to 80%, between kind of 60 and 70% of adults said that meat, dairy, and seafood were either acceptable or very acceptable. Next in line was the plant source protein, so the things like legumes and pea protein. Almost 60% of the older adult cohort that were surveyed said that plant-based protein is either acceptable or very acceptable. But here is our concern. So some of those sustainable protein sources that are the more novel protein sources, like the single-cell, insect, and in vitro, weren't quite as acceptable. So about 20% said that they'd be willing to accept single-cell protein within their diet. About 9% said they'd accept insect-based protein foods, and only about 6% were accepting of the in vitro lab meat-based protein sources, with the majority saying that these were unacceptable or very unacceptable. So this is a real challenge when it comes to changing eating behaviours. Consumer acceptance is a really big barrier to change. So if we're trying to reduce meat intake, for example, we need to find foods that are acceptable for consumers to integrate into their diets, or we need to find ways to change perceptions around some of these alternative protein foods. So that's the first key challenge. It's looking at changing the demand and therefore looking at consumer acceptance around changing that demand. So what if we looked at the opposite side? So what if we changed the supply of foods? And this second piece of research that I'm going to talk you through looked at just that. So they asked the question, well, what would happen if we just removed animals from US agriculture? And this was a data modeling study. So they simulated what would happen to greenhouse gas emissions and to food intake or diets if they did this. And so On the positive side of things, there was an increase in 23% in total food produced. So the reason for this is that if you remove all animals from US agriculture, then there is more land available, but also the crops that would be used as animal feed, if they're fit for human consumption, then those can be redirected for human consumption, resulting in this overall 23% increase in the total amount of food that's produced. As well as that, it showed that it would possibly reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 28%. So greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture would be reduced by about 28%. So that's quite positive, and that would result in an overall impact on total greenhouse gas emissions of a reduction of about 2.6%. So that's just keeping in mind that there's lots of other things that contribute to total greenhouse gas emissions, so transport, energy, and so on. So all of that is quite positive. But from a kind of nutrition perspective, I suppose I'm interested in what would that do to people's diets? And they also examined that in this simulation. So what it actually showed, if you removed all animal foods from US agriculture, it would result in an increase in energy intake. And the reason for that is that people would need to increase their energy intakes just to meet some of their nutrient requirements. So there are essential nutrients in our diet, and we have requirements that we need to achieve. So in order to achieve those minimum requirements, it would mean an overall increase in the amount of energy that people are consuming. And that's because we know that things like meat and dairy are quite nutrient dense. So we do get a lot of our micronutrients in particular from those types of foods. And even with that increase in energy intake, there was still certain micronutrient deficiencies in the US diets as a result. And so this is a problem, not only just because of the micronutrient deficiencies, but that increase in energy intake. I mentioned that overweight and obesity is an issue in both Ireland and internationally. And this increase in energy intake would make that problem even worse. So that's something that we want to avoid. So that's the second challenge. Removing animal source foods altogether from the diet has an impact on our dietary intake and then on our nutrition and health. So we have this kind of environment nutrition trade-off. So a low environment impact diet doesn't necessarily mean a healthy diet. And we need to start to look at achieving a balance between environment and health when we're developing sustainable healthy eating guidelines. So the next piece of research I'm just going to highlight is a study that was done by Sinead McCarthy and colleagues. And they took our national adult nutrition survey data and they looked at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with different types of foods, and they ranked them just to see how we're doing in terms of our overall greenhouse gas emissions associated with diet, and then looking at what foods are contributing most to those greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things which aren't surprising given what we've just looked at. So the top 3 ranking foods contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in the Irish diet is red meat is number 1, not surprising. Dairy is number 2, and then starchy staples is number 3. And our starchy staples contribute is our number 1 food in terms of our total energy intake. So that's why they're contributing or kind of ranked higher there on the greenhouse gas emissions list as well. So these are the kind of foods that we would be looking at potentially reducing to have a more environmentally sustainable diet. But I just want to highlight that kind of nutrition trade-off. So I kind of dug into that National Adult Nutrition Survey data, and within that National Adult Nutrition Survey report, we can look and see what foods contribute to micronutrient intakes. So I just summarized some of that here, picking out those top 3 foods, the meat, dairy, and starchy staples. So for example, meat is ranked first in terms of our vitamin D intakes. So we get most of our vitamin D from meat. It's ranked second for our iron intakes, meaning that it's the second food group that contributes to iron. As you can see, our starchy staples is ranked number 1 for our iron intake. So we get the majority of our iron from the starchy staples. Similarly for dairy, it's ranked quite highly for calcium, and that's an obvious one. And it's also ranked highly for vitamin A. So these three food groups are contributing quite significantly to our micronutrient intakes. And it's even more significant when we look at different population groups. So children would be considered quite a vulnerable group in terms of dietary intakes, and that's because they're growing, and therefore relative to adults, they have increased micronutrient needs to support that healthy growth. So if we look at meat and dairy in particular, they're ranked in the top 3 for all micronutrients in children's diets. So they're really important sources of micronutrients in children's diets. So this is just something that we need to keep in mind as we start to think about moving towards a sustainable diet. So that brings me to my next point. I suppose in Ireland, what do we need to do to start moving towards that sustainable healthy diet? So I just want to put a bit more flesh or detail on that definition of a sustainable healthy diet. And the FAO published these guiding principles just last year, and they break it down into 3 sections. It starts off with the health aspects of a sustainable healthy diet. So that's things like variety, balanced across food groups. It moves on to the environmental aspects of a sustainable healthy diet. So that's things like reducing food loss and waste. And then the last kind of section is the sociocultural aspects of a sustainable healthy diet. So that's looking at accessibility and desirability, for example. But for the moment, I'm going to focus on the first 6. So that's those health ones that are more directly related to our food intake or our diet. So just to kind of list those off for you, the first is that sustainable healthy diet, exclusive breastfeeding until 6 months is the recommendation, and that's already the recommendation here in Ireland. The second guiding principle from the FAO is great variety of minimally processed foods balanced across different food groups. The third is whole grains, legumes, nuts, and an abundance and variety of fruits and vegetables. The fourth, moderate amounts of eggs, dairy, poultry, fish, and small amounts of red meat. The fifth is safe and clean drinking water. And then the sixth, adequate energy and nutrients for growth, development, and physical activity. So what I want to do next is look at those guiding principles and compare them to our national health eating guidelines. And our national health eating guidelines are in the form of the food pyramid, which I've presented here in the slide. So I want to compare them and essentially see how are our national dietary guidelines in comparison to these guiding principles, and are there things that we need to focus on to bring our diets closer to what the FAO recommends for a sustainable and healthy diet. So starting with that first guiding principle, minimally processed foods balanced across food groups. And essentially that's what our Healthy Ireland food pyramid is. It makes recommendations for 4 main food groups: vegetables, salad, fruit, wholemeal cereals and breads, potatoes, pasta and rice, that's on the 2nd shelf, milk, yogurt and cheese on the 3rd shelf, meat, poultry, fish, eggs, beans and nuts on the 4th shelf. And then the top of the pyramid is small amounts of fat, spreads and oils. And then foods and drinks that are high in fat, sugar and salt should be consumed a maximum of once to twice per week. So essentially the food pyramid aligns quite well with that first guiding principle of minimally processed foods balanced across food groups. The next 2 I'm going to combine together, and that's including an abundance and variety of fruits and vegetables and including whole grains. And again, as you can see, these 2 food groups form the base of our pyramid. So the recommendations in Ireland are for between 5 and 7 servings of fruits and vegetables and 3 to 5 servings of our whole grains, cereals, food group. And that kind of 3 to 5 servings is dependent on kind of age and activity levels. So again, this is the foundation of the pyramid. So these 2 food groups are really important in our health eating guidelines, but also obviously critical in a sustainable healthy diet, as they are ranked quite highly in those guiding principles. In terms of these 2 food groups, it's important that we get a range of different coloured fruits and vegetables to meet our vitamin and mineral needs. And then with our whole grain intakes, whole grains are very good for energy, but also provide fiber to support a healthy digestive system. So the fourth guiding principle I want to talk about is our moderate dairy intake. So the FAO recommends moderate dairy intake. You can see that our dairy shelf is third on the food pyramid, and the recommendation here is 3 servings per day for adults and 5 servings for teenagers. And a serving is about a glass of milk, a carton of yogurt, or about 25 grams of cheese. And dairy is important in our diet. I mentioned it already in looking at Irish adult intakes and children's intakes. And I said that it ranks quite highly for certain micronutrients. In particular, calcium is a really important one. It's also a really good source of protein and a source of other vitamins, so things like B12, riboflavin, and vitamin A. So dairy is really important as it is a very nutrient-dense food. And our 3 servings recommended in our healthy eating guidelines is very much in line with that guiding principle of moderate dairy intake. So the next guiding principle is legumes and nuts, moderate eggs, poultry, and small amounts of red meat. And this is the one I want to highlight a little bit. Our food pyramid recommends 2 servings a day, and a serving is between 50 and 75 grams of meat or poultry, 100 grams of fish, 2 eggs, and then when it comes to the beans and nuts, about a 1/4 cup of cooked beans or about 100 grams of tofu. And the reason I want to highlight this one, our food pyramid recommends 2 servings, as I said, with additional details. So if you look at the more detailed healthy eating guideline booklet, you'll see that our own guidelines do recommend reducing lean meat to 2 to 3 days per week. It does also recommend choosing different foods on different days, so introducing variety when it comes to this food group, and also limiting processed meats. So those recommendations are there, but I suppose the reason I'm highlighting this food group is we're not achieving those recommendations. So we're really not in line with that guiding principle. So if I look into the National Adult Nutrition Survey report, and if I count up our average daily intake of different types of meats, it comes to somewhere between 150 and 200 grams of meat per day, which is more than what we should be consuming, both to keep in line with our own healthy eating guidelines, but also to keep in line with the guiding principle from the FAO. So this is one of the shelves that we really need to work on as a population. So really just trying to follow those recommendations, choosing variety, putting more emphasis on legumes and nuts in our diet, and not always relying on meat and poultry as our source of as our source of protein in our diets, reducing our lean red meat intake to 2 to 3 days, limiting processed meats altogether in our diet. And I'm also going to emphasize the oily fish one here. So the recommendation in Ireland is to consume at least 1, if not 2 portions of oily fish per week. And this is one that most of us aren't good at achieving. So that's another one to focus on here. So still a bit to do in terms of achieving this guiding principle for legumes and nuts, moderate eggs, poultry, and small amounts of red meat. The last guiding principle then that I'm going to talk you through is adequate energy and nutrients, reaching but not exceeding our needs. And this, I feel, is a really, really important one. We really need to start to think about overconsumption as a form of food waste. So I mentioned overweight is a problem in Ireland and globally. So in Ireland, about 60% of adults are either overweight or obese. So it is a problem. Eating more sustainably, reducing our portion sizes, meeting our nutrient and energy requirements instead of exceeding them, would result not only in benefits for the environment, but also in benefits for our own health. So this is my second kind of really important point. I think it's thinking about overconsumption from that kind of food waste perspective, and really trying to eat in line with guidelines to meet our nutrient needs and not exceed them. So I suppose the take-home message that I'm trying to get across in those last few slides is that even if we could start to follow our own healthy eating guidelines. So if we could adhere more closely to what our national healthy eating guidelines are, we'd actually be taking steps towards a more sustainable and healthy diet. And just to reinforce that point, I'm showing a study here, or a piece of research that looked at that in the UK. So they took dietary intake data and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that data, and they grouped people depending on how well they adhered to healthy eating recommendations. So if a person achieved between 0 and 2 healthy eating recommendations, they were put into the very low group. If they achieved 3 or 4 of the healthy eating recommendations, they were put into the low group. And if they achieved between 5 and 9 of the healthy eating recommendations, then they were put into the intermediate to high group. And then they compared the greenhouse gas emissions of those different groups of their diets, and also compared the water footprint of those diets. But I'm going to focus again on greenhouse gas emissions. So overall, 30%, so almost a third of the population in the UK were meeting between 5 and 9 dietary guidelines. And if you look at the figure on the right-hand side, if you were in that intermediate to high group, your greenhouse gas emissions associated with your diet were 30% lower than if you were in the very low group. So having or meeting the guidelines meant that you were already eating more sustainably. In particular, if you were meeting the red and processed meat guideline, that had the biggest impact on the greenhouse gas emissions associated with your diet. And then the other point that I want to kind of pick out from this piece of research was they showed that fruit and vegetable guidelines, or adherence or meeting the fruit and vegetable guidelines, was actually associated with a higher water footprint. And that's why we see the higher water footprint in that intermediate to high group. So that's that blue bar on the figure. But on the other side of things, meeting the fruit and vegetable guidelines was associated with the biggest positive impact on health. So again, it's that environment nutrition trade-off that we talked about. But overall, just the take home here is, if we can move towards our healthy eating guidelines, we're going to be eating more sustainably. Okay, that brings me to my last slide. So just, I suppose, a few additional pointers, as well as starting to eat more closely to what our recommendations are in Ireland. There's a few other things that you can do. Number one is choose local seasonal fruit and vegetables more often. Number two is something that I have emphasized already, and that's choosing variety from that meat, fish, eggs, nuts, beans group. So think of ways to mix up the foods that you're consuming to meet that guideline of 2 servings. So maybe trying to have, for example, a meat-free day, or trying recipes where you have half meat and half beans, for example. There's lots of different ways, and there's lots of good recipes out there to try to start changing how you consume protein in your diet, or how you meet the servings on that shelf. The third point is to keep your plate in proportion. So this is kind of around meeting and not exceeding those nutrient and energy requirements. And I've just showed this image on the right-hand side, which is actually taken from the Healthy Eating Guideline booklet that I'll refer to on the final slide. But just looking at that plate, that's a dinner plate, and you can see that half the plate is covered with vegetables, about a quarter of it is the protein source food, and then about a quarter of it is the starchy foods. So trying to achieve that balance in your plate as well. And then lastly, a couple of other things. Trying to avoid any unnecessary packaging when buying foods, reducing food loss and food waste. And again, a reminder there that the overconsumption being a form of food waste. And then finally, just trying to plan ahead helps you to use all parts of the food and to use up any leftovers from preparing foods as well. And all of these really will help you take steps close kind of towards achieving that sustainable, healthy diet. So that's it for me. This is my last slide, and it's really just highlighting some of the resources that you might find useful. So I've talked a lot about our own healthy eating guidelines, and there's lots of really good resources available on the HSE website. The other one I want to point out here is from the National Dairy Council, and they've just published a booklet that looks at eating sustainably. So I'd also recommend going and having a look at that. So then just to finish off, I want to mention that the next public lecture in the series is by Dr. Amy Malee, and it's looking at nutrition and cancer. And then also just to say that all of the talks, including this talk, are available on the UCD Institute of Food and Health YouTube page. So then finally, just to thank you all for listening in, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.